Somewhere in a museum storage room in Berlin, there is a fragment of limestone no larger than a human hand. It was carved more than 3,300 years ago, during one of the most turbulent periods in the history of ancient Egypt. On its surface, rendered in the distinctive elongated style of the Amarna period, is the profile of a young woman. Her chin is slightly raised. Her lips are parted, as though she is about to speak. Her name, inscribed in hieroglyphs beside her face, identifies her as Meritaten, beloved of Aten, the eldest daughter of Pharaoh Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti. She was, by the evidence that survives, one of the most prominent women of her age. She held the title Great Royal Wife. She may have governed Egypt during one of the most chaotic transitions of power in the history of the ancient world. And then she vanished, not metaphorically, not in the way that people gradually fade from the historical record as the years pile up. She vanished deliberately. Her name was chiseled off monuments. Her images were defaced. Her very existence was scraped from the walls of temples and palaces by the people who came after her. The same people who dismantled everything her father had built. Consider what that means. A woman who stood at the center of the most powerful civilization on earth. A woman whose likeness was carved in stone and painted on palace walls. A woman who may have ruled as pharaoh in her own right, was erased so thoroughly that for 3,000 years the world did not know she had existed. Her name was not whispered. Her story was not told. Her life, whatever it contained, whatever dramas and decisions and moments of courage or despair filled it, was treated as something that should never have happened, something that needed to be undone, retroactively, permanently, as though it were a stain on the fabric of time itself. The ancient Egyptians had a word for this. They called it damnatio memoriae, or rather, the Romans gave it that name centuries later. The Egyptians simply did it. They understood, perhaps better than any civilization, before or since, that memory is not passive. Memory is a structure. It can be built, and it can be demolished. To destroy a person's name in ancient Egypt was not merely a political act. It was a metaphysical one. The Egyptians believed that the survival of the name, the Ren, was essential for the survival of the soul in the afterlife. To erase a name from every monument, every inscription, every temple wall, was to kill the person not merely in the present, but in eternity. It was the ultimate punishment, the annihilation of the self across all dimensions of existence, past, present, and future. Meritaten was subjected to this punishment. Not alone, of course. Her father, Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh who had abandoned the traditional gods of Egypt in favor of a single deity, the sun disk called the Aten, suffered the same fate. Her mother, Nefertiti, the most famous queen of the ancient world, was similarly targeted. The entire Amarna experiment, the revolutionary religious and artistic movement that had reshaped Egyptian civilization for nearly 2 decades, was dismantled with a thoroughness that borders on the obsessive. Temples were torn down. Statues were smashed. Inscriptions were recarved. The city of Akhenaten, the new capital that Akhenaten had built from nothing in the desert, was abandoned and left to crumble. And the names of the people who had presided over this revolution were struck from the king lists, the official chronologies that the Egyptians maintained to record the succession of their rulers. As far as the official record was concerned, the Amarna period never happened. It was a gap in time, a void, a silence imposed by the victors upon the vanquished. And yet the silence was never quite complete. Fragments survived. A boundary stela here, a diplomatic letter there, a broken statue face emerging from the sand after 30 centuries of burial. Piece by piece, archaeologists have recovered enough to know that the erasure was vast, that the things they have found are only a fraction of what once existed, and that the story of the Amarna royal family, Meritaten included, is riddled with gaps that may never be filled. We know the outline, we do not know the interior. We know the shape of her life as a silhouette, defined by the things that surround it rather than by the life itself. And in those gaps, in those silences, in the spaces where her name was once carved and is now a smooth, deliberately emptied surface of stone, there lies a question that is as much about us as it is about her. What else has been erased? What other lives, what other reigns, what other truths have been scraped off the walls of history by people who found them inconvenient? By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why the story of Meritaten, this almost forgotten princess of a disgraced dynasty, matters far beyond the boundaries of Egyptology. Her story is a lens through which we can examine one of the most disturbing truths about human civilization: that history is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what the powerful chose to remember. And the gap between those two things, between what happened and what was remembered, is vast enough to swallow entire lives, entire reigns, entire ways of understanding the world. Meritaten lived at the center of a revolution. She witnessed its triumph, its crisis, and its catastrophic end. She may have tried to hold it together as it collapsed around her. And then she was erased, not by time, not by accident, but by deliberate human action. By the hands of people who decided that her memory was dangerous, and that the safest thing to do with a dangerous memory is to destroy it utterly. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Meritaten, we must first understand the world she was born into, a world that was simultaneously one of the most literate and one of the most fragile civilizations in human history. Ancient Egypt, for all its monumental grandeur, for all its temples of stone and pyramids that have endured for millennia, was a civilization built on papyrus. And papyrus rots. The Egyptians were among the first peoples in the world to develop a comprehensive system of writing. Hieroglyphic script, the formal writing used on temples and monuments, dates to the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization, according to current scholarly understanding. Alongside it, the Egyptians developed hieratic, a cursive form of writing used for daily administrative and literary purposes, and later demotic, an even more simplified script used in the final centuries of pharaonic culture. These writing systems were not mere tools of record-keeping. They were, for the Egyptians, technologies of immortality. The written word had sacred power. To write a thing was to make it real. To inscribe a name was to anchor it in existence. To destroy an inscription was, in a very real sense, to unmake the thing it described. The primary medium for everyday writing in ancient Egypt was papyrus, a paper-like material made from the pith of the papyrus plant, a tall reed that grew abundantly in the marshes of the Nile Delta. Papyrus was light, portable, relatively easy to produce, and provided a smooth writing surface that could accommodate detailed hieratic or demotic text. The Egyptians produced enormous quantities of it. Administrative records, tax documents, legal contracts, medical treatises, literary works, religious texts, personal letters, mathematical problems, astronomical observations, all of these were written on papyrus scrolls and stored in archives, temples, and private collections throughout the Nile Valley. But here is the problem. Papyrus is organic material, it decays. In the humid climate of the Delta, where much of Egypt's administrative activity was concentrated, papyrus can deteriorate within decades. Even in the dry conditions of Upper Egypt, where the desert climate provides better preservation, papyrus is vulnerable to insects, fire, moisture, and simple physical wear. The survival of any individual papyrus document across thousands of years is not the norm. It is the exception. It is a statistical anomaly, a lucky accident, a consequence of a particular document ending up in a particular location with particular environmental conditions that happen to slow the inevitable process of organic decay. The scale of what has been lost is difficult to grasp. Scholars estimate that we possess, at best, perhaps 1 or 2% of the written material that ancient Egypt produced over the course of its 3,000-year history. Some estimates are even more pessimistic, suggesting that the survival rate for papyrus documents is less than 1%. The numbers are striking. If Egypt produced even a modest quantity of written material each year over 3 millennia, The total corpus would number in the millions of documents. What we have today, scattered across the museums and collections of the world, amounts to perhaps a few 100,000 fragments, many of them damaged, incomplete, or illegible. The rest is gone, not hidden, not waiting to be discovered, gone. This means that the Egypt we study, the Egypt we think we know, is a reconstruction based on a vanishingly small fraction of the evidence that once existed. It is as though someone tore a novel into 1,000 pieces, scattered those pieces across a desert, and then, 3,000 years later, someone else found 40 or 50 of them and attempted to reconstruct the plot. The general outline might be discernible. Some scenes might be recoverable, but vast stretches of the narrative would be missing, and the reader would never know whether the missing sections contained minor details or critical turning points that changed the meaning of the entire story. The situation is made worse by the fact that the surviving material is not a random sample. It is biased in multiple directions simultaneously. Stone inscriptions survive far better than papyrus, which means we have a disproportionate amount of formal, public, royal propaganda. The things that pharaohs chose to carve on temple walls to glorify their reigns, and a disproportionately small amount of the private, personal, administrative, and intellectual material that would give us a richer picture of Egyptian life. Upper Egypt, with its dry climate, has preserved far more material than Lower Egypt, which means our picture of Egyptian civilization is geographically skewed, and religious texts, which were frequently copied and recopied across centuries because of their ritual importance, survive in greater quantities than secular texts, which were often produced in single copies and discarded when they were no longer needed. The implications for our understanding of the 18th dynasty, the period in which Meritaten lived, are profound. The 18th dynasty was one of the most powerful and culturally productive periods in Egyptian history. It began around 1550 before the Common Era, according to standard chronologies, with the expulsion of the Hyksos, a people of Near Eastern origin who had ruled Lower Egypt during the Second Intermediate Period. The founders of the 18th dynasty, a Theban royal family that included warriors like Sequenenre Tau and Amos, reunified the country and launched an era of military expansion, diplomatic activity, and cultural achievement that would make Egypt the dominant power in the ancient Near East for centuries. The pharaohs of the early 18th dynasty were builders, conquerors, and administrators of the first order. Thutmose I extended Egyptian power deep into Nubia and led military campaigns into Syria, Palestine. Hatshepsut, one of the very few women to rule Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, oversaw a period of peace, trade, and architectural achievement that included the construction of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, a structure carved into the living rock of the Theban cliffs. Thutmose III, often called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, conducted 17 military campaigns in the Levant and expanded the Egyptian empire to its greatest territorial extent, from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile in the south to the Euphrates River in the north. And then there was Amenhotep III, Meritaten's grandfather. His reign, lasting approximately 38 years, was a golden age in the fullest sense of the phrase. Egypt under Amenhotep III was the wealthiest, most powerful, and most culturally sophisticated nation in the ancient world. The Amarna letters, a diplomatic archive discovered in 1887 at the site of Akhenaten's abandoned capital, provide a vivid picture of the international system over which Egypt presided. Kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, and the Hittite Empire wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh as a near equal, requesting gold which Amenhotep had in abundance, offering royal daughters in marriage, and negotiating the complex web of alliances and rivalries that bound the great powers of the Bronze Age together. Amenhotep III built on a scale that rivaled the pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom. His mortuary temple on the west bank of Thebes was the largest religious structure in Egypt, though almost nothing of it survives today except the two massive seated statues known as the Colossi of Memnon, each standing approximately 18 meters tall. He expanded the Temple of Amun at Karnak, commissioned a magnificent palace complex at Malkata on the west bank of the Nile, and filled Egypt with statues, stelae, and inscriptions proclaiming his greatness. His queen, Tai, was a woman of formidable intelligence and political influence. The daughter of a provincial official named Yuya and his wife Thuya, whose unusually well-preserved mummies were discovered in 1905 in the Valley of the Kings. It was into this world of extraordinary wealth, power, and cultural confidence that Meritaten's father, Amenhotep IV, was born. He would later change his name to Akhenaten, and he would set in motion the most radical transformation in the history of Egyptian religion and politics. But before we turn to that revolution, and to the role Meritaten played within it, we need to understand something about the nature of knowledge in ancient Egypt, because it is this understanding that makes the loss of the Amarna period so devastating. Knowledge in ancient Egypt was not freely distributed. It was concentrated in a priestly and scribal elite that controlled access to literacy, religious ritual, and administrative power. The proportion of the Egyptian population that could read and write has been estimated at between 1 and 5%. Literacy was not merely a practical skill, it was a marker of social status, a prerequisite for government service, and a form of sacred knowledge that connected the literate individual to the divine order of the cosmos. Scribes were trained in temple schools called houses of life, institutions that functioned simultaneously as schools, libraries, archives, and research centers. The House of Life at Heliopolis, the ancient center of sun worship near modern Cairo, was particularly famous and may have housed one of the largest collections of texts in the ancient world. These houses of life were the repositories of Egyptian knowledge in every domain: medicine, mathematics, astronomy, theology, ritual, law, literature, and history. The medical papyri that survive, such as the Edwin Smith Papyrus, which describes surgical procedures with a sophistication that would not be matched for millennia, and the Ebers Papyrus, which catalogues hundreds of remedies and treatments, are believed to be copies of much older texts that were maintained and transmitted through these institutions. The mathematical papyri, such as the Rhind Papyrus and the Moscow Papyrus, demonstrate a level of practical mathematical knowledge that included the calculation of areas and volumes, the use of fractions, and the solution of problems that would today be classified as algebra. The astronomical knowledge of the Egyptians, though less well documented than that of the Babylonians, was sufficient to maintain a calendar, predict the annual flooding of the Nile, and align monumental structures with celestial phenomena with a precision that continues to impress modern surveyors. The fragility of this system becomes apparent when we compare it with other ancient traditions of knowledge preservation. The Mesopotamians, who developed writing independently in the form of cuneiform pressed into clay tablets, left behind a far more durable archive than the Egyptians. Clay, unlike papyrus, does not decay under normal environmental conditions. It can shatter, it can erode, but it does not rot. And in many cases, fire, which destroys papyrus instantly, actually hardens clay and makes it more durable. The result is that we possess hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets from ancient Mesopotamia, a corpus that dwarfs the surviving Egyptian papyrus collection and provides a far more detailed picture of daily life, economic activity, and intellectual culture. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled by the Assyrian king in the 7th century before the Common Era, contained more than 30,000 clay tablets covering everything from epic literature to medical recipes, to astronomical observations, to royal correspondence. When Nineveh was sacked in 612 before the Common Era, the library's contents were buried in the rubble of the palace, where they were preserved for millennia until excavated by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 19th century. The irony is pointed. The destruction of the library is what preserved it, because the tablets were sealed beneath layers of debris that protected them from further damage. Egypt had no such fortunate catastrophe. Its papyrus archives were not buried and sealed. They were exposed to the ongoing processes of decay, reuse, and destruction that attend any living civilization. Papyrus was expensive to produce, and old documents were frequently recycled. Their contents washed or scraped off, so that the blank sheets could be reused. The material used to make papyrus cartonnage, the layered papyrus casing, that was used to create mummy masks and coffin decorations, has yielded some of the most important documentary finds in Egyptology, precisely because it was made from discarded papyrus sheets that would otherwise have been lost entirely. The texts on these sheets were not considered important by the people who recycled them. They were administrative records, personal letters, draft documents, the mundane paperwork of a functioning bureaucracy. But to modern scholars, they are priceless, because they provide glimpses of the everyday reality of Egyptian life that the formal monuments, with their carefully curated propaganda, never mention. The oral tradition, which existed alongside the written one in every ancient culture, is even more vulnerable to loss. Ancient Egypt was a society in which stories, songs, prayers, spells, medical knowledge, and practical wisdom were transmitted orally from generation to generation, alongside and sometimes independently of the written record. The written texts we possess are, in many cases, snapshots of an oral tradition that was far richer and more varied than any single written version can capture. A story committed to papyrus is a story frozen at one moment in time, in one version by one scribe. The oral tradition from which it was drawn may have contained dozens of variants, each shaped by the personality, memory, and creative impulse of the individual storyteller. When the oral tradition is broken, when the last person who knows a particular song or story or prayer dies without having transmitted it to a successor, the loss is absolute. There is no archive to consult. There is no backup copy. The knowledge simply ceases to exist. We see the consequences of this throughout the ancient world. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are believed to have existed as oral compositions for centuries before they were committed to writing, probably in the 8th century before the Common Era. The versions we possess are therefore not the originals, but particular crystallizations of a fluid tradition that may have differed substantially from one performance to the next. How many other Greek epics existed in the oral tradition and were never written down? We know from ancient sources that the Trojan War cycle included many poems beyond the Iliad and Odyssey, works known as the epic cycle, most of which survive only as brief summaries written by later commentators. The originals, the full poems that audiences once listened to with rapt attention, are gone. The same pattern holds across civilizations. The Vedic traditions of the Indian subcontinent were transmitted orally for centuries with extraordinary precision, using mnemonic techniques so effective that the texts are believed to have remained exceptionally stable across generations. But even this most rigorous of oral traditions could not prevent the loss of contextual knowledge, the understanding of what certain words meant, how certain rituals were performed, what certain references pointed to. The texts survived. The full understanding of their meaning did not. The Celtic peoples of pre-Roman Europe had a rich oral tradition maintained by Druids, who memorized vast quantities of religious, legal, and historical material, but who, according to Julius Caesar, deliberately refused to commit their knowledge to writing. When the Druidic tradition was suppressed by the Roman conquest, the knowledge it contained was lost almost entirely. We know the Druids existed. We know they were learned. We do not know, with any specificity, what they knew. War and conquest have been the most catastrophic agents of knowledge destruction throughout human history. The pattern is consistent and brutal. An invading army conquers a city. The temples and libraries are looted or burned, sometimes deliberately as an act of cultural domination, sometimes incidentally as a byproduct of the general violence. The scribes and scholars who maintain the knowledge are killed, enslaved, or scattered. The institutional structures that supported learning, the funding, the facilities, the social status that encouraged young people to pursue scholarly careers are dismantled, and the knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries, the texts, the techniques, the traditions, the tacit expertise begins to evaporate. Not all at once. not in a single dramatic conflagration, but steadily, relentlessly, as the community of practitioners shrinks and the chain of transmission frays and eventually snaps. Natural disasters have played their role as well, though their contribution to knowledge loss is often underestimated. Earthquakes have toppled libraries and archives throughout the Mediterranean world. Floods have soaked papyrus collections into illegible pulp. Volcanic eruptions have buried entire communities along with everything they knew. The eruption that destroyed Pompeii and Herculaneum in 79 of the Common Era preserved, in carbonized form, a library of philosophical papyri in the Villa of the Papyri. More than 1,800 papyrus scrolls, many of them works of Epicurean philosophy by Philodemus of Gadara, were carbonized by the volcanic heat into fragile black cylinders. These scrolls survived only because the pyroclastic flow that killed everyone in the city simultaneously sealed the library in hardened volcanic material. Without the catastrophe, the scrolls would almost certainly have decayed naturally and been lost entirely preservation through destruction. It is a paradox that recurs throughout the history of knowledge. Fire has been perhaps the single greatest destroyer of written knowledge in human history. Papyrus is extremely flammable. Parchment, while somewhat more resistant, will burn readily. The great fires of history, whether set deliberately by conquerors or ignited accidentally by carelessness, have consumed knowledge on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Libraries have burned with depressing regularity throughout the centuries. The Imperial Library of Constantinople was partially destroyed by fire on multiple occasions and lost much of its remaining collection during the sack of the city in 1204. The Grand Library of Baghdad was destroyed during the Mongol siege of 1258. The National Library of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo was deliberately shelled during the siege of 1992, consuming an estimated 2 million volumes. The pattern does not change, only the names and dates are different. In Egypt, the most devastating losses were not caused by a single catastrophic event, but by the slow grinding process of decay, recycling, and deliberate destruction that operated continuously across millennia. Every pharaoh who defaced the monuments of a predecessor destroyed knowledge. Every temple that was abandoned and its archives left to the elements lost knowledge. Every tomb robber who discarded papyri while searching for gold destroyed knowledge. The cumulative effect of these small individual acts of destruction, none of them significant in isolation, was the loss of the vast majority of what ancient Egypt produced. Consider what we know we have lost from the 18th dynasty alone. The diplomatic archive discovered at Tel El Amarna in 1887. The Amarna letters contains approximately 380 clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform. These tablets are correspondence between the Egyptian court and the rulers of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittite Empire, and vassal states in the Levant. They provide an extraordinary window into international politics of the 14th century before the Common Era, but the surviving tablets are only a fraction of the original archive. The missing tablets, which may have covered different periods of Akhenaten's reign or earlier correspondence from Amenhotep III, would have provided crucial context for understanding the political landscape in which Meritaten grew up. The tomb of Tutankhamun, Meritaten's probable half, brother, or nephew, is the most complete royal burial ever found in the Valley of the Kings. Yet even it shows signs of disturbance and reorganization. Many artifacts originally belonged to other members of the Amarna royal family, including pieces that bear the names of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and possibly Meritaten herself, reassigned and relabeled for Tutankhamun's use. The tomb is not merely a burial. It is a salvage operation, a hasty reassembly of materials from the collapsed Amarna project. What it tells us about the royal family is invaluable. What it fails to tell us is immense. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. Because the loss of the Amarna period was not merely a consequence of natural decay. It was engineered, it was planned. It was carried out systematically by people who had the power to decide what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. The restoration of the traditional religion under Tutankhamun and his successors was accompanied by a deliberate campaign to erase the Amarna period from the official record. But all of this knowledge was vulnerable, because it was concentrated in institutions and transmitted through chains of human expertise. A house of life that lost its funding, that was damaged by war or natural disaster, that suffered a decline in the number of trained scribes willing and able to maintain its collections, could lose centuries of accumulated wisdom within a generation. The texts themselves might physically survive for a time, but without trained readers to interpret them, without scribes to copy them onto fresh papyrus. As the old scrolls deteriorated, without scholars who understood the context and could apply the knowledge they contained, the texts would become progressively less accessible until they were, for all practical purposes, dead. This vulnerability was not hypothetical. It was demonstrated repeatedly throughout Egyptian history. The First Intermediate Period, a time of political fragmentation following the collapse of the Old Kingdom, saw the disruption of many institutions that had maintained knowledge for centuries. The Second Intermediate Period, during which the Hyksos controlled Lower Egypt, caused further disruptions. And the Amarna period, the brief but violent revolution that Akhenaten imposed on Egyptian civilization, may have caused the single most concentrated loss of institutional knowledge in Egyptian history, because it did not merely disrupt existing institutions. It attempted to replace them. When Akhenaten abandoned Thebes and founded his new capital at Akhetaten, modern Tel El Amarna, he was not simply moving the seat of government. He was attempting to create a new center of knowledge, a new institutional framework for the production, preservation, and transmission of Egyptian culture. The temples he built at Akhetaten were not merely places of worship. They were administrative centers, economic hubs, and repositories of the new religious knowledge that the Aten revolution demanded. The old temples at Thebes, Memphis, and Heliopolis, the very institutions that had maintained Egyptian knowledge for centuries, were defunded, marginalized, and in some cases actively suppressed. The damage this caused is incalculable. When the Amarna experiment collapsed, when the old religion was restored and the new capital was abandoned, the institutions that Akhenaten had created were destroyed, and the institutions he had undermined were in no condition to immediately resume their former functions. There was a gap, a break in the chain of transmission. Some knowledge was recovered, much was not. The priests who returned to the temples of Amun at Karnak and Luxor found damaged archives, scattered collections, and broken chains of expertise. The scribes who had served the Aten, who had been trained in the new religious texts and the new artistic conventions, either converted back to the old religion and tried to remember what they had been taught before the revolution, or they were purged and their expertise was lost. The artistic revolution of the Amarna period illustrates this loss with particular clarity. Under Akhenaten, Egyptian art underwent a transformation so dramatic that it is instantly recognizable even to people with no knowledge of Egyptian history. The conventional, idealized, rigidly formal style that had characterized Egyptian art for centuries was replaced by a style that was radically different. Elongated faces, exaggerated features, swollen bellies, thin limbs, and a naturalistic intimacy in the depiction of the royal family that had no precedent in Egyptian art. The king and queen were shown kissing their daughters, bouncing children on their laps, riding together in chariots, and worshipping the Aten side by side with their arms raised. This was revolutionary. Previous pharaohs had been depicted as divine, remote, unchanging figures. Akhenaten chose to be depicted as a human being, a father, a husband, a man with a distinctive and unusual body. The artists who developed this style had to unlearn centuries of artistic convention and create something entirely new. They succeeded brilliantly. The art of the Amarna period is among the most distinctive and emotionally powerful in the entire history of Egyptian civilization. When the Amarna period ended, this artistic tradition was suppressed as thoroughly as the religious revolution it had served. Artists were instructed to return to the old conventions. The naturalistic intimacy was abandoned. The elongated proportions were discarded. The informal family scenes disappeared, and with them disappeared the techniques, the training methods, the aesthetic principles, and the accumulated craft knowledge that had produced some of the most beautiful objects ever created in the ancient world. The famous bust of Nefertiti, discovered in the workshop of the sculptor Tutmosis at Tel El Amarna in 1912 by the German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, is a masterpiece of portraiture that combines the naturalism of the Amarna style with a technical precision that suggests years, perhaps decades, of specialized training. The sculptor who created it was part of a community of artists who had developed their skills in the specific context of the Amarna Revolution. When that context was destroyed, the community dispersed, and the particular combination of skill, vision, and technique that had produced works like the Nefertiti bust was lost. The restoration stela of Tutankhamun, erected early in the young king's reign by his advisors, provides a glimpse of the official justification for the erasure. The text describes the state of Egypt at the end of the Amarna period in terms of catastrophe. The temples in ruins, the gods neglected, the army weakened, prayers going unanswered. Whether this description was accurate or merely political propaganda designed to justify the new regime's policies is debated. But the intent is clear. The Amarna period was to be remembered, insofar as it was remembered at all, as a time of chaos and divine punishment, a mistake that needed to be corrected. The people who had presided over that period, including Meritaten, were to be expunged from the record as part of the correction. Meritaten lived at the very center of this catastrophe. She was born into the old world, raised in the new one, and survived into the period of restoration that rejected everything her family had represented. She was not a passive observer. The evidence that survives suggests she was an active participant in the events that reshaped Egyptian civilization, a woman of political significance whose role in the transition from the Amarna period to the post-Amarna restoration remains one of the most debated questions in Egyptology, and the fact that we know so little about her, that the deliberate erasure of the Amarna period has left her story full of holes and contradictions and unanswerable questions, is itself a demonstration of the principle we have been exploring, that knowledge is fragile, that memory is constructed, and that the past is not a fixed record but a contested terrain on which the powerful impose their version of events and the powerless are silenced. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the ancient past. We assume that what survives is representative. We assume that what is remembered is what mattered. We assume that the gaps in the record are random, the result of natural processes like decay and erosion, rather than the result of deliberate human choices about what should be preserved and what should be destroyed. The story of Meritaten challenges every one of these assumptions, because her erasure was not an accident. It was a policy, and what that policy destroyed, the full story of a woman who may have governed the most powerful nation on earth during one of its most perilous transitions, is something we may never recover. Then something happened that changed everything, or rather, something was found. In 1887, a peasant woman digging in the ruins of Tel El Amarna, the desolate site in Middle Egypt where Akhenaten had built his capital, discovered a cache of clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform writing. She did not know what they were, neither, initially, did the local antiquities dealers to whom she sold them. Several tablets were damaged or destroyed before scholars recognized their significance. When the surviving tablets were finally examined by experts, the result was a sensation. The Amarna letters, as they came to be known, were the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian court during the reigns of Amenhotep III and his son, Akhenaten. They contained letters from the kings of Babylon, Assyria, Mitanni, the Hittite Empire, and dozens of vassal states in the Levant, and they transformed our understanding of the late Bronze Age international system. They also provided the first detailed evidence for the world in which Meritaten had lived. But the Amarna letters were only the beginning. Over the decades that followed, systematic excavation of Tel El Amarna by Flinders Petrie in the 1890s, by the German Deutsche Orient Gesellschaft under Ludwig Borchardt between 1907 and 1914, and later by the Egypt Exploration Society under a succession of directors, including John Pendlebury and Barry Kemp, gradually revealed the outlines of the city that Akhenaten had built. And within those outlines, scattered across the ruins of palaces, temples, workshops, and administrative buildings, were the traces of Meritaten's life, her name inscribed on boundary stelae, her image carved on temple walls, her presence recorded in the diplomatic correspondence and administrative records that had survived the destruction of the city she had known. Meritaten was born in the early years of her father's reign, before the move to Akhenaten, possibly while the royal court was still based at Thebes or at the old administrative capital of Memphis. She was the first of at least 6 daughters born to Akhenaten and Nefertiti, a birth that was commemorated in inscriptions and artwork that depicted the royal family with an intimacy unprecedented in Egyptian art. From the earliest years of her life, Meritaten was presented not as a background figure but as a central participant in the religious and political project that her father was constructing. She appears on boundary stelae at Akhenaten, the great stone markers that define the limits of the new city, listed among the members of the royal family in whose honor the city was being built. She appears in temple reliefs standing beside her parents as they worship the Aten, her small figure reaching up toward the rays of the sun disk that terminate in tiny hands offering the Ankh, the symbol of life. The significance of these images cannot be overstated. In traditional Egyptian art, royal children were depicted infrequently and almost never in the context of state or religious ceremonies. The pharaoh was typically shown alone or with his queen, performing rituals, smiting enemies, or receiving the blessings of the gods. Children, when they appeared at all, were shown at a much smaller scale, tucked into corners of larger scenes, their presence acknowledged but not emphasized. The Amarna Revolution changed this completely. Akhenaten and Nefertiti are consistently shown with their daughters, often in scenes of domestic intimacy that have no parallel in the rest of Egyptian art. The royal couple sitting together on thrones while their daughters climb on their laps. The family riding in a chariot together, the parents kissing and caressing their children. These scenes suggest either that the Amarna Revolution placed unusual emphasis on the royal family as a theological unit, with the family serving as an earthly mirror of the divine triad of the Aten, the king, and the queen, or that Akhenaten personally desired a different kind of representation, one that emphasized his humanity rather than his divinity. Perhaps both explanations are true simultaneously. Meritaten's prominence in these scenes grew as she grew older. By the middle years of her father's reign, she had become a figure of considerable importance in the ceremonial life of the court. She is depicted participating in religious rituals, receiving gifts from foreign dignitaries, and standing in positions of honor beside her parents. Her name appears with increasing frequency in the administrative records of the period, associated with estates, endowments, and official functions that suggest she held real economic and political power. She was not merely the pharaoh's daughter. She was becoming a political figure in her own right. And then, around year 12 of Akhenaten's reign, the situation changed dramatically. Something happened to the royal family that altered its configuration in ways that the surviving evidence documents only partially. Multiple members of the family seem to have died within a short period. Meritaten's younger sister, Mayati, appears to have died, possibly in childbirth, as suggested by a scene in the royal tomb at Amarna that shows the royal family mourning over the body of a young woman, while a nurse holds an infant. 3 of the youngest daughters, Nefertiti, Tasheret, Neferneferuar, and Setapenre, disappear from the record around this time, their fates unknown. And Nefertiti herself, the most visible woman in Egypt, vanishes from the evidence in a way that has generated one of the most contentious debates in Egyptology. Some scholars believe Nefertiti died around year 12 or 13. Others believe she assumed accordancy with Akhenaten, ruling alongside him under a new name, possibly Ankeperu Neferuaten, a throne name that has been found on several objects from the late Amarna period. Still, others believe she survived Akhenaten and ruled briefly as sole pharaoh after his death. The evidence is fragmentary, contradictory, and susceptible to multiple interpretations. What is clear is that the disappearance of Nefertiti from her traditional role created a vacuum in the royal household, and the person who appears to have filled that vacuum was Meritaten. At some point during the final years of Akhenaten's reign, Meritaten was elevated to the title of Great Royal Wife. This title, the highest title a woman could hold in ancient Egypt, was traditionally reserved for the pharaoh's principal queen. For Meritaten to receive it while her father was still alive implies one of two possibilities, neither of them simple. Either she became her father's consort, a scenario that, while disturbing by modern standards, was not unprecedented in Egyptian royal practice, where marriage between close relatives was used to consolidate political power and maintain the divine bloodline of the royal house. Or she became the wife of another man who held the title of pharaoh, or Corgent, alongside Akhenaten. That man, if he existed, may have been the mysterious figure known as Smenkhkare. Smenkhkare is one of the most puzzling figures in 18th dynasty history. His origins are uncertain. His relationship to the rest of the royal family is debated. His reign, if he reigned at all as an independent pharaoh, was extremely brief, perhaps only a year or two. Some scholars identify him as a younger brother or son of Akhenaten. Others have proposed that Smenkhkare was actually Nefertiti herself, ruling under a male throne name. Still others believe he was a member of the royal household, who was elevated to the Corgency to stabilize the succession. The evidence is a handful of inscriptions, a few wine jar labels from Amarna, and a set of objects from the Valley of the Kings that may or may not belong to him. From this fragmentary material, scholars have constructed competing narratives that differ fundamentally in their conclusions about who Smenkhkare was when he ruled and what happened to him. What is known with reasonable certainty is that Meritaten bore the title Great Royal Wife in association with the throne name Ankheperur, which has been attributed to both Smenkhkare and to a ruler called Nefertiti. Whether these were two different people or the same person under different names is, once again, disputed. The tangle of names, titles, and identities is so dense that Egyptologists have been debating it for more than a century without reaching consensus. And the reason they cannot reach consensus is not that they lack intelligence or methodology. It is that the evidence has been systematically destroyed by the very people who came after the Amarna period and decided that none of it should be remembered. And it gets worse, because the mysteries multiply when we turn to the events that followed Akhenaten's death. The transition of power from Akhenaten to Tutankhamun, Meritaten's probable half, brother or nephew, is one of the most poorly documented successions in Egyptian history. The gap between the two reigns, a period that may have lasted from 1 to 3 years, is filled with shadows and contradictions. Someone ruled Egypt during this interval. But who? Was it Smenkhkare? Was it Nefertiti under the name Nefertiti? Was it Meritaten herself, the eldest surviving daughter of the old king, elevated to the throne in a desperate attempt to preserve the dynasty? There is evidence, debated and incomplete, but tantalizing, that a female pharaoh ruled Egypt during this transitional period. The throne name, Ankheperur, Nefertiti, appears on a number of objects with feminine grammatical endings, suggesting that the ruler who bore this name was a woman. Some scholars have attributed this name to Nefertiti. Others have attributed it to Meritaten. The distinction matters enormously, because if Meritaten ruled as pharaoh, even briefly, she would be one of the very few women in Egyptian history to have held sole power over the most powerful state in the ancient world. She would have done so at a moment of extreme crisis, with the religious revolution her father had launched collapsing around her, the traditional priesthood reasserting its power, and the international position of Egypt deteriorating as vassal states in the Levant took advantage of Egyptian internal turmoil to rebel. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. We may never know the answer. Not because the evidence is hidden and waiting to be discovered, not because some future excavation will turn up the missing piece that resolves the puzzle, but because the evidence was deliberately destroyed. The people who restored the traditional religion after the Amarna period did not merely neglect the records of the heretic pharaohs. They actively sought them out and destroyed them. They chiseled names off monuments. They dismantled temples and reused the blocks as fill material inside new constructions. They overcarved inscriptions, replacing the names and images of the Amarna royals with their own or with those of earlier, more acceptable pharaohs. They erased Akhenaten, Nefertiti, Smenkhkare, and Meritaten from the official king lists, creating a seamless transition from Amenhotep III directly to Horemheb, as though the entire Amarna period, spanning roughly 20 years and at least 3 or 4 rulers, had never occurred. The scale of this erasure is staggering when considered carefully. The Amarna period lasted approximately 17 to 20 years. During that time, one of the most radical social, religious, and artistic transformations in the history of any civilization was implemented, maintained, and ultimately reversed. The documentation of this period, the administrative records, the diplomatic correspondence, the religious texts, the legal documents, the personal letters, the artistic output, must have been vast. And yet what survives is a scattered handful of fragments, enough to tell us that something extraordinary happened, enough to tantalize us with glimpses of the people who were at its center, but not enough to answer the most basic questions about the lives of those people. Consider what we do not know about Meritaten. We do not know the year of her birth with any certainty. We do not know the exact nature of her relationship with Smenkhkare, or even whether Smenkhkare and Nefertiti were the same person or 2 different people. We do not know whether she ruled as pharaoh. We do not know the year, place, or circumstances of her death. We do not know where she was buried, or whether her burial has been found and misidentified. We do not know whether any of the unidentified female mummies in the collections of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo might be hers. We do not know whether she had children who survived infancy, though there is evidence of a daughter named Meritaten, Tasheret Meritaten the Younger, whose own fate is equally obscure. We do not know what she believed, what she hoped, what she feared, what she thought about the revolution her father had launched and the catastrophe she watched it become. We know her name, we know some of her titles. We have a few images of her face, stylized and filtered through the artistic conventions of the Amarna period. Beyond that, there is silence. And behind that silence lies one of the most haunting episodes in the diplomatic history of the ancient world. Among the Hittite archives discovered at the ancient capital of Hattusa, modern Bagaskoy in Turkey, there is a letter from an Egyptian queen to Suppiluliuma I, the powerful king of the Hittites. The queen identified in the Hittite text by the rendering of her Egyptian title as Dakamunzu, which scholars have interpreted as a transliteration of the Egyptian phrase Ta Hamet Nasu, meaning the king's wife wrote to Suppiluliuma with an extraordinary request. She told him that her husband had died. She told him that she had no son. She told him that she did not wish to marry one of her own subjects, and she asked him to send one of his sons to marry her, promising that her chosen bridegroom would become pharaoh of Egypt. The request was unprecedented. No Egyptian queen had ever before offered the throne to a foreign prince. Suppiluliuma was suspicious. He sent an envoy to verify the claim. The envoy confirmed it. Suppiluliuma, convinced that the offer was genuine, sent his son Zenanza to Egypt. Zenanza never arrived. He was murdered, en route, almost certainly assassinated by someone in Egypt who opposed the marriage and the transfer of power it implied. The incident provoked a war between Egypt and the Hittite Empire that would last for decades. The identity of Dakamunzu, the queen who wrote this extraordinary letter, has been debated for nearly a century. The 2 leading candidates are Ankhesenamun, Tutankhamun's queen and Meritaten's younger sister, and Meritaten herself. Each identification has its supporters and its problems. If Dakamunzu was Ankhesenamun, then the letter was written after the death of Tutankhamun, and the queen's desperation makes sense in the context of a young widow facing pressure to marry a powerful courtier she did not wish to wed. If Dakamunzu was Meritaten, then the letter was written after the death of Smenkhkare or Akhenaten himself, and the queen's desperation reflects a different but equally dire situation. A woman trying to hold together the remnants of a collapsing dynasty by securing a powerful foreign alliance. The debate remains unresolved. It may remain unresolved forever, because the evidence that could settle the question, the Egyptian records of the correspondence, the internal deliberations that led to the decision to write to the Hittite king, the identity of whoever ordered the assassination of Zenanza, has been destroyed. The Hittite side of the correspondence survives because it was archived in clay at Hattusa. The Egyptian side, which would have been recorded on papyrus, is gone. The asymmetry is itself a lesson in the archaeology of knowledge. Clay endures. Papyrus does not. And the side of the story that was written on the more durable medium is the side we have. The other side is silence. The Dakamunzu affair, whatever its precise details, illuminates something essential about the nature of lost knowledge. Here is an episode that had enormous geopolitical consequences. The murder of Zenanza led to a war between two of the greatest powers of the Bronze Age. That war reshaped the political landscape of the ancient Near East for generations. And the identity of the woman who set those events in motion, the queen who made the extraordinary decision to offer Egypt's throne to a foreign prince, is unknown, not uncertain, not debatable, unknown. The evidence that could have identified her has been destroyed, and no amount of scholarly ingenuity can reconstruct what no longer exists. Modern science has attempted to fill some of these gaps with results that are themselves contested and incomplete. In 2010, a team led by Zahi Hawass, the former Secretary General of Egypt's Supreme Council of Antiquities, published a DNA study of several royal mummies from the 18th dynasty, including the mummy of Tutankhamun. The study used genetic analysis to establish familial relationships between the mummies and to attempt to identify some of the anonymous remains found in the Valley of the Kings. The results were dramatic. The study identified the mummy known as the Younger Lady, found in tomb KV30, 5 in the Valley of the Kings as the mother of Tutankhamun, and as a full sister of the man buried in KV55, who was identified as Akhenaten. If correct, this would mean that Tutankhamun's parents were full siblings, brother and sister, a degree of inbreeding that would have had significant implications for the young king's health and may help explain the genetic abnormalities detected in his mummy. But the identification of the Younger Lady has been challenged by some scholars who question the methodology of the DNA study, the possibility of contamination in the ancient samples, and the assumptions underlying the genealogical reconstructions. Some have proposed that the Younger Lady might be Nefertiti rather than a sister of Akhenaten. Others have suggested she could be Meritaten or another member of the royal family. The debate is ongoing and the stakes are high because the identity of the Younger Lady bears directly on the question of who Tutankhamun's mother was, and by extension, on the family relationships and political dynamics of the late Amarna period. The mummy question extends to Meritaten herself. No mummy has been positively identified as hers. Several candidates have been proposed. 2 female mummies found in tomb KV20, one in the Valley of the Kings, designated KV21A and KV21B, have been the subject of DNA testing. One of these was suggested as a possible candidate for Akhenaten, Meritaten's younger sister. The other remains unidentified. A mummy designated as the Elder Lady from KV35 was identified in the 2010 study as Queen Tai, Meritaten's grandmother. But Meritaten herself remains a ghost in the archaeological record. A woman without a body, a queen without a tomb, a ruler perhaps without a monument. The absence is itself significant. In ancient Egypt, the burial of a royal person was not merely a matter of disposing of a body. It was a complex theological event that required extensive preparation, significant resources, and the participation of a community of priests, craftsmen, and administrators. A royal tomb was typically begun years or decades before it was needed, excavated from the living rock of the Valley of the Kings or the cliffs of the Theban necropolis, its walls painted with scenes from the Book of the Dead or other funerary texts, its chambers filled with the objects the deceased would need in the afterlife: furniture, clothing, food, jewelry, cosmetics, games, weapons, and the shabti figurines, small servant figures that would perform labor on the dead person's behalf in the next world. If Meritaten was a great royal wife, if she was a co-regent or even a pharaoh in her own right, she would have had a tomb prepared for her. That tomb would have contained inscriptions, images, and objects that documented her life, her titles, her relationships, and her beliefs. It would have been, in effect, a biographical archive in stone, and it is either undiscovered, which is possible, but increasingly unlikely given the extent of archaeological exploration in the Valley of the Kings, or it was found, plundered, and its occupant's identity erased or transferred, which is what happened to many royal burials during the periods of tomb robbery that plagued the Theban necropolis in the 20th and 21st dynasties. The reburial of royal mummies was a regular practice in ancient Egypt, particularly during the 21st dynasty, when the priests of Amun organized mass reburials of the royal dead to protect them from further plundering. During these reburials, mummies were stripped of their remaining valuables, rewrapped, labeled with dockets identifying the deceased, and placed in communal caches in inconspicuous tombs. The cache discovered in Tomb DB 320, a cliff tomb near Deir el-Bahari in 1881, contained the mummies of more than 50 royal and noble persons, including Thutmose III, Seti I, and Ramesses II. The cache in KV 30, 5 discovered in 1898, contained additional royal mummies. Some were identified by their dockets, others were not. The unidentified mummies, stripped of their original wrappings and context, could be anyone. They could be members of the Amarna royal family, reburied without identification, because the priests performing the reburial did not know or did not wish to record who they were. They could be Meritaten herself, lying in a museum case or a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, anonymous and unrecognized, her identity lost not because her body was destroyed, but because the label was removed. The possibility is both tantalizing and distressing. It means that the physical remains of Meritaten may still exist. They may be in a collection somewhere, catalogued under a generic designation, studied by anthropologists who have no idea whose bones they are examining. The information that would connect those remains to the woman who once stood at the center of the most powerful court in the ancient world, who may have ruled Egypt during one of its most desperate hours, who may have written the most extraordinary diplomatic letter in the history of the ancient Near East. That information was deliberately erased by people who decided that her memory was not worth preserving. This is what makes the loss of Meritaten's story something more than an academic puzzle. It is a moral failure, not hers, ours, or rather, the moral failure of the people who decided that certain lives, certain reigns, certain truths were too dangerous to remember. The damnatio memoriae imposed on the Amarna royal family was an act of political violence, as deliberate and as destructive as the burning of a library or the sacking of a city. It was the murder of a memory, and like all murders, it cannot be undone. The dead do not return. The erased do not reappear. The chisel marks on the walls of Karnak and Luxor, where the names of the Amarna pharaohs were scraped away and replaced with the names of their successors, are wounds in the stone that mirror wounds in the record of human experience. They are evidence not just of what happened in the 14th century before the Common Era, but of a universal human tendency that has repeated itself throughout history and across civilizations. The tendency to destroy what is inconvenient, to silence what is uncomfortable, to erase what challenges the preferred narrative of the powerful. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The erasure almost worked. For 3,000 years, it did work. The name of Akhenaten was unknown. The name of Nefertiti was forgotten. The name of Meritaten was less than forgotten. It was as though she had never existed. The king lists carved in the temples of Abydos, Karnak, and Saqqara. The official records that Egyptian pharaohs maintained document the succession of rulers from the first dynasty onward, skipped directly from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, omitting Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, Neferuaten, Tutankhamun, and I, the entire sequence of rulers who had presided over the Amarna period and its immediate aftermath. For anyone reading those lists, and for the thousands of years during which they were the primary source of information about Egyptian chronology, the Amarna period simply did not exist. It was a hole in time, an absence that was not even recognized as an absence, because the lists presented a smooth, unbroken sequence that gave no indication anything was missing. The rediscovery began slowly. In the early 19th century, European travelers and scholars exploring the ruins of Egypt began to notice references to a mysterious pharaoh whose name appeared in some sources but not in the official king lists. Jean-François Champollion, the scholar who deciphered the Rosetta Stone and unlocked the hieroglyphic script in 1822, encountered references to Akhenaten, but could not fully integrate them into the known chronology. Carl Richard Lepsius, the Prussian Egyptologist who led a major expedition to Egypt in the 1840s, visited the ruins of Tel el Amarna and recorded some of the inscriptions he found there. But the significance of the site was not yet understood. It was not until the late 19th and early 20th centuries that the Amarna period began to emerge from its imposed obscurity. The discovery of the Amarna letters in 1887 provided the first major cache of evidence. Flinders Petrie's excavations at Tel el Amarna in 1891 and 1892 revealed the outlines of the abandoned city. The discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun by Howard Carter in 1922 brought international attention to the late 18th dynasty and indirectly to the Amarna period that preceded it, and the ongoing excavation of Tel el Amarna throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, most notably by the Egypt Exploration Society's Amarna project, under the direction of Barry Kemp, has gradually filled in details that would otherwise be completely unknown. But perhaps the most remarkable source of evidence for the Amarna period came from an unexpected direction. When the pharaohs who succeeded Akhenaten demolished his temples, they did not simply destroy the blocks. Stone was valuable. They reused it, the standard-sized blocks from which Akhenaten's temples had been built, small blocks known as talatat, measuring roughly 52 by 26 by 24 centimeters, were used as fill material inside the pylons and walls of new constructions at Karnak, Luxor, and Hermopolis. There, sealed inside the walls of later temples, protected from weathering and further damage, the talatat blocks preserved the carved and painted decorations of Akhenaten's temples in a state of remarkable freshness. When archaeologists began to dismantle and study these blocks in the 20th century, they found thousands of them, each one a fragment of a jigsaw puzzle that, when reassembled, revealed scenes from the temples and palaces of the Amarna period that would otherwise be completely unknown. The Talatat project, which has involved decades of painstaking work by teams of scholars, including Ray Winfield Smith and Donald Redford, has recovered tens of thousands of decorated blocks and has assembled them into scenes that depict the daily life of the Amarna court with extraordinary vividness. Among these scenes are images of Meritaten, her parents, her sisters, and the rituals and ceremonies of the Aten religion. The irony is profound. The very act of demolition that was intended to erase the Amarna period from memory inadvertently preserved it. The blocks that were hidden inside the walls of the temples that replaced Akhenaten's constructions became time capsules, sealed containers of information that survived precisely because they were buried and forgotten. The destroyers of memory, in their thoroughness, became its unwitting preservers. Yet even with the Talatat blocks, the Amarna letters, the excavations at Tel el Amarna, the tomb of Tutankhamun, and the DNA studies of the royal mummies, our picture of the Amarna period remains deeply incomplete. We have, at best, perhaps 5 to 10% of the evidence that once existed. We can see the outlines of events, but not their details. We can identify the major figures, but not fully understand their relationships. We can describe the institutions, but not explain their inner workings. And at the center of this fragmented picture stands Meritaten, a woman whose importance is attested by the titles she held and the positions she occupied, but whose inner life, whose motivations, whose choices, whose ultimate fate remain hidden behind the chisel marks and the silence. The ancient Egyptians had a phrase that appears in several funerary texts, the one whose name lives. It was the ultimate aspiration, the hope that by inscribing a name in stone, by preserving it in ritual and prayer and the daily offerings of the mortuary cult, a person could achieve a kind of immortality that transcended the death of the physical body. Meritaten's name does live, but barely, and not in the way that was intended. It lives in the fragments that escaped the chisel, in the talatat blocks buried inside the walls of her enemies' temples, in the clay tablets of a foreign archive that recorded her title, but not her personal name, in the damaged reliefs of an abandoned city in the desert. Her name lives the way a flame lives in the wind, flickering, uncertain, always on the verge of going out. 3,300 years after her death, we are still not certain who she was, what she did, or what became of her. And the people who made that uncertainty permanent, the people who chiseled her name from the walls and struck her reign from the records, succeeded in their primary objective. They made her forgettable. They made her a gap in the narrative, a silence in the conversation, a figure so obscured by the dust of deliberate oblivion that most people who visit Egypt, who marvel at the pyramids and the temples and the golden mask of Tutankhamun, have never heard her name. The math is striking. The Amarna period lasted roughly 17 to 20 years. The subsequent erasure lasted centuries. The rediscovery, beginning in the 19th century, has been ongoing for approximately 200 years. And in those 200 years, with all the resources of modern archaeology, epigraphy, DNA analysis, spectral imaging, and computational analysis, we have recovered only a small fraction of what was lost. The destroyers had a 3,000-year head start. The information they destroyed cannot be recreated. The names they chiseled away cannot be restored. The papyri they burned cannot be unburned. We are left with what they missed, what they accidentally preserved, what they were too careless or too hurried to destroy completely. And from these scraps and fragments, these accidental survivors, we have pieced together a story that is both extraordinary and heartbreaking. The story of a woman who lived at the hinge point of one of the most significant transformations in the history of human civilization, and whose own story was nearly lost forever. The erasure of Meritaten is not an isolated phenomenon. It belongs to a pattern of knowledge loss that spans civilizations, centuries, and continents. To understand how thoroughly a life can be unmade, how completely a technology can be forgotten, how silently a discovery can vanish from the collective memory of humanity, we need to step outside the narrow confines of Egyptology and examine the broader landscape of human knowledge and its fragility. What we find when we look at that landscape with clear eyes is a terrain littered with the wreckage of forgotten achievements, each one a reminder that the line between knowing and not knowing is far thinner than we like to believe. Consider Roman concrete. The Romans developed a building material of extraordinary durability, a form of concrete that used volcanic ash, known as pozzolana, mixed with lime and seawater to create structures that have survived for more than 2,000 years. The Pantheon in Rome, completed around 126 of the Common Era, has the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, spanning more than 43 meters, and it remains structurally sound after nearly 2 millennia. Roman harbors built with this concrete submerged in seawater for centuries have not only survived but have actually grown stronger over time. Modern analysis has revealed that the interaction between the volcanic ash, lime, and seawater produces a mineral called aluminum tobermorite, which crystallizes in the concrete and fills cracks as they form, a process of self-healing that modern materials science has only recently begun to understand. Modern concrete, by contrast, begins to degrade within decades. The reinforcing steel inside modern structures corrodes when water and salt penetrate the concrete, causing it to crack and spall. Bridges, highways, and buildings constructed in the 20th century are already requiring repair or replacement. The Roman formula, which produced structures that have outlasted the empire that built them by more than 1,500 years, was lost when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century. The knowledge was not suppressed or destroyed, it simply faded from use as the economic and institutional infrastructure that supported large-scale concrete construction broke down. The quarries that supplied the volcanic ash closed. The skilled workers who knew how to mix, pour, and cure the material dispersed. The engineering tradition that understood how to design structures using the material was disrupted. And within a few generations, the recipe was gone. Modern scientists have analyzed Roman concrete samples, identified the key ingredients and processes, and begun to understand the chemistry that makes it so durable. But a full replication of the Roman technique, one that produces material of comparable longevity and self-healing capacity, has not yet been achieved. We know what they did. We do not fully know how they did it. The pattern is the same with Greek fire, the incendiary weapon that made the Byzantine Empire nearly invulnerable at sea for centuries. Greek fire was a substance that could be projected from bronze tubes mounted on the prows of warships, igniting on contact and burning fiercely even on the surface of water. It was used decisively in the defense of Constantinople during the Arab sieges of 674 to 678 and 717 to 718 of the Common Era. The formula was a closely guarded state secret, known only to a small number of specialists within the Byzantine military establishment. When the Byzantine Empire declined and eventually fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the formula was lost. Modern scholars have proposed numerous candidates for the active ingredient of Greek fire, including naphtha, a volatile petroleum derivative, sulfur, saltpeter, quicklime, and various combinations of these materials. Experiments have been conducted using these proposed formulas, and some have produced impressive results, but none has fully replicated the described properties of Greek fire, particularly its ability to burn on water and its apparent capacity to be projected as a liquid stream under pressure. The exact formula remains unknown, and it may remain unknown permanently because the knowledge was held by too few people, was transmitted through too narrow a channel, and was too closely tied to a specific political and military institution that collapsed before the knowledge could be independently preserved. Damascus steel presents a similar case, though with additional layers of complexity that illustrate the role of material supply chains in the preservation of technical knowledge. Damascus steel, more properly called Wootz steel, was a form of crucible steel produced in India and the Middle East that was prized for its distinctive watered pattern, its exceptional sharpness, and its ability to hold an edge. Swords made from Damascus steel were legendary throughout the medieval world, and accounts from the Crusades and other medieval conflicts describe blades capable of cutting through European armor and even through other swords. The production of Damascus steel declined in the 18th century and eventually ceased entirely. The reasons for its disappearance are debated, but two factors are widely cited. The first is the depletion of the specific ore sources that provided the raw material. Wootz steel required iron ore with particular trace element concentrations, including vanadium and other elements that contributed to the distinctive nanostructure of the finished steel. When those ore sources were exhausted or became inaccessible, the steel could no longer be produced to the same standard. The second factor is the disruption of the craft tradition that knew how to work with the material. The production of Damascus steel was a complex multi-stage process that required precise control of temperatures, carbon content, and forging techniques. This knowledge was held by families of smiths who transmitted it from father to son over generations. When the economic demand for the product declined, when mass-produced European steel became cheaper and more readily available, the incentive to maintain the tradition diminished, and the knowledge was lost through simple disuse. Modern metallurgists have made significant progress in understanding the structure of Damascus steel. Analysis using electron microscopy has revealed the presence of carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires in the steel, structures that are produced at the nanoscale by the specific combination of materials and processing conditions used in traditional production. These nanostructures are responsible for the steel's exceptional mechanical properties, but replicating them reliably using modern methods has proved extremely difficult because the precise conditions under which they form depend on the specific trace element composition of the ore, the exact temperature profile of the smelting process, and the specific forging techniques used by the original smiths. all of which are imperfectly understood. The Antikythera mechanism pushes the mystery of lost knowledge into an entirely different dimension. Discovered in 1901 in a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of the Greek island of Antikythera, this device is a complex mechanical calculator that uses interlocking bronze gears to model the movements of the Sunday, the Moon, and possibly some of the planets. It predicts eclipses, tracks the cycle of the ancient Olympic Games, and represents a level of mechanical sophistication that was not equaled in the European tradition until the development of astronomical clocks in the 14th century, more than 1,000 years later. The Antikythera mechanism is not merely a curiosity. It is evidence of an entire tradition of mechanical engineering that has otherwise left almost no trace in the historical record. The device is too complex, too refined, too precisely engineered to be a one-off invention, the product of a single genius working in isolation. It must be the product of a tradition, a lineage of designers and craftsmen who developed the techniques of gear, cutting, bearing, making, and precision metalwork over generations. Where are the earlier devices in this lineage? Where are the prototypes, the experimental models, the intermediate steps between simple sundials and this astonishingly sophisticated calculator? They do not exist, or rather, they no longer exist. They have been lost, melted down for their bronze, broken and discarded, corroded beyond recognition, or simply overlooked by archaeologists who did not know what they were looking at. The Antikythera mechanism tells us that the ancient Greeks possessed mechanical capabilities that we would never have suspected on the basis of the literary evidence alone. Cicero mentions astronomical devices in his writings. Archimedes is credited with building mechanical planetaria, but without the physical evidence of the Antikythera mechanism, discovered by chance in a shipwreck, we would have no way to confirm or understand these literary references. We would dismiss them as exaggeration or metaphor. The mechanism survived because it sank to the bottom of the sea, where the cold, dark, oxygen, poor conditions preserved the bronze that would have been recycled on land. It is an artifact that exists only because of a catastrophe, a shipwreck that killed everyone on board but preserved the cargo for posterity. Without that catastrophe, the Antikythera mechanism would have been lost. And with it, the evidence of an entire tradition of ancient mechanical engineering. Let that sink in. How many other ancient technologies are unknown to us, simply because no shipwreck, no volcanic eruption, no fortunate burial preserved the physical evidence? How many traditions of craftsmanship, as sophisticated and as surprising as the one that produced the Antikythera mechanism, have vanished without a trace, because every example was recycled, corroded, or destroyed? The question is unanswerable, and that is precisely the point. The world of undeciphered scripts provides another window into the scale of what has been lost. Linear A. The writing system used by the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete has defied decipherment despite more than a century of effort. We have approximately 1,400 inscriptions in Linear A, most of them short administrative texts on clay tablets, found at the Palace of Knossos and other Minoan sites. We can read the numbers and identify some logograms, but the language behind the script remains unknown until it is deciphered. If it is ever deciphered, the intellectual and cultural life of the Minoans, one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, will remain largely inaccessible to us. The Indus Valley script presents an even more challenging case. The Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwest India from roughly 2600 to 1900, before the Common Era according to standard dating, was one of the largest and most urbanized civilizations of the ancient world. Its cities, including Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, featured advanced urban planning, sophisticated drainage and sanitation systems, standardized weights and measures, and a writing system that appears on more than 4,000 objects, primarily seals used for trade and administration. Despite decades of effort by some of the most talented linguists and epigraphers in the world, the Indus script remains undeciphered. Some scholars have even questioned whether it represents a true writing system at all, or whether it is a set of non-linguistic symbols used for administrative or religious purposes. If it is a true script, it records a language spoken by millions of people across a territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, a language that has been completely lost. The Voynich manuscript, a mysterious illustrated codex dating to the 15th century, adds yet another layer to this litany of the unreadable, written in an unknown script and illustrated with bizarre images of plants that do not correspond to any known species, astronomical diagrams, and naked female figures immersed in pools of green liquid. The Voynich manuscript has defeated every attempt at decipherment since it was rediscovered by the Polish book dealer Wilfrid Voynich in 1912. Carbon dating has confirmed that the parchment dates to the early 15th century, ruling out the possibility that it is a modern forgery. But the text, which fills more than 200 pages, remains unreadable. It may be a cipher, a constructed language, a hoax, or a genuine text in a language that has been otherwise lost. The scholarly community remains divided. The manuscript remains silent. Each of these examples, Roman concrete, Greek fire, Damascus steel, the Antikythera mechanism, Linear A, the Indus script, the Voynich manuscript, represents a different facet of the same fundamental problem. Human knowledge is not permanent. It is not cumulative. It does not march steadily forward from generation to generation, each cohort adding to the stockpile left by the one before. Knowledge is a living thing. It requires active maintenance. It requires people who understand it, institutions that support them, economic conditions that sustain both, and political systems that do not actively seek to destroy what has been preserved. When any of these conditions fail, knowledge begins to die. And when knowledge dies, it dies completely. There is no half-knowledge, no ghost of a forgotten formula lingering in the air. There is only presence and absence, knowing and not knowing, the light of understanding and the darkness of ignorance. And the transition between the two can happen with terrifying speed. The connection to Meritaten should be clear. She is not a lost formula or an undeciphered script. She is a lost person, a human being whose life has been reduced to a handful of fragments by the deliberate action of people who decided that her existence was politically inconvenient. But the mechanisms of her loss are the same mechanisms that destroyed the formula for Greek fire, the technique for producing Damascus steel, and the tradition of mechanical engineering that created the Antikythera mechanism. In each case, knowledge that was held by a small number of people was lost when the conditions that sustained it were disrupted. In each case, the loss was facilitated by the vulnerability of the medium in which the knowledge was recorded, whether that medium was papyrus, oral tradition, family craft practice, or institutional memory. And in each case, the loss was irreversible, because once knowledge passes below the threshold of viability, once the last person who knows a thing dies or is silenced, the thing they knew is gone from the world forever, as completely as if it had never existed. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. Because if we extend this principle to its logical conclusion, we are forced to acknowledge that the knowledge we currently possess, the knowledge on which our civilization depends, the technologies we use every day, the scientific understanding that underpins our medicine, our agriculture, our energy systems, our communications, is not inherently more secure than the knowledge of the ancient Egyptians, the Romans, the Byzantines, or the Minoans. Our knowledge is stored on different media. It is maintained by different institutions. It is embedded in different economic and political systems. But it is subject to the same fundamental vulnerability. It requires active maintenance by a community of practitioners, and if that community is disrupted, the knowledge it holds can be lost. The case of Hatshepsut provides the closest parallel to Meritaten's erasure and illustrates how the deliberate destruction of memory operates across long time scales. Hatshepsut was the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty, one of the most successful rulers in Egyptian history, and one of the very few women to hold the title of pharaoh in her own right. She ruled for approximately 22 years, presiding over a period of peace, prosperity, and monumental building that included the construction of her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, one of the most beautiful structures in the history of architecture. She sent trading expeditions to the land of Punt, a distant region on the Horn of Africa or the Arabian coast that provided Egypt with myrrh, gold, ebony, and exotic animals. She raised a pair of enormous obelisks at the Temple of Karnak, each one carved from a single block of Aswan granite and covered in gold leaf. She was, by any measure, one of the most accomplished rulers Egypt ever produced. And yet, after her death, her successor, Thutmose III, her stepson and nephew, ordered a campaign to erase her memory from the record. Her images were chiseled off temple walls. Her statues were smashed and buried. Her name was removed from inscriptions and replaced with the names of her predecessors. Her cartouches were overcarved. Her monuments were enclosed within walls that hid them from public view. The erasure was systematic, though not quite as thorough as the later erasure of the Amarna period. Hatshepsut's name continued to appear in some lists and some inscriptions that the defacers missed or chose to ignore. But the intent was clear: to remove a female pharaoh from the official record, to pretend that her reign had never happened, to restore the narrative of unbroken male succession that the Egyptians considered proper and divinely ordained. The parallels with Meritaten are instructive. Both women held positions of exceptional power in a society that was deeply uncomfortable with female authority in the political sphere. Both were subjected to damnatio memoriae after their deaths, their names and images targeted for destruction by successors who viewed their reigns as anomalous or threatening. Both were rediscovered by modern archaeology only after centuries of imposed oblivion, and both cases demonstrate the same unsettling principle that the survival of a historical figure's memory depends not on the significance of their achievements, but on the willingness of subsequent generations to permit those achievements to be remembered. Hatshepsut's case also illustrates the limitations of deliberate erasure. Despite the systematic campaign to destroy her memory, enough traces survive to allow modern scholars to reconstruct her reign in considerable detail. Inscriptions that were overlooked, statues that were buried rather than destroyed, texts in the tombs of her courtiers that mentioned her name, fragments of her obelisks that remained visible even when their lower sections were enclosed within walls. All of these provided the evidence from which Egyptologists have pieced together the story of her remarkable reign. The erasure failed because it was not thorough enough. Some evidence was missed. Some was preserved accidentally. Some was deliberately hidden by loyal followers who anticipated the coming persecution and took steps to protect their queen's memory. Whether anyone performed the same service for Meritaten, whether any loyal scribe or priest or courtier deliberately preserved evidence of her life and reign in anticipation of the erasure that was to come, is unknown. The Amarna erasure was more thorough than Hatshepsut's, more sustained, more ideologically motivated. The successors who erased Hatshepsut were primarily concerned with restoring the appearance of male succession. The successors who erased the Amarna royals were motivated by a deeper imperative: the restoration of the traditional religious order, which the Amarna revolution had fundamentally challenged. The Amarna erasure was not merely political, it was theological. It was an attempt to undo a blasphemy, to restore the cosmic order, to heal a wound in the relationship between Egypt and its gods. The zeal with which it was carried out reflected the depth of the religious conviction behind it, and the result was an erasure more complete and more enduring than anything Hatshepsut had suffered. The Spanish destruction of the Maya codices presents the same pattern on a different continent, in a different century with a different justification, but the same devastating result. When the Spanish conquistadors and missionaries arrived in the Yucatan Peninsula in the 16th century, they encountered a civilization that had developed one of the most sophisticated writing systems in the pre-Columbian Americas. The Maya had produced thousands of codices, books made from bark paper folded into accordion, like pages, and painted with elaborate hieroglyphic texts and illustrations. These codices recorded centuries of astronomical observations, calendar calculations, historical narratives, religious rituals, medical knowledge, and information about agriculture, trade, and governance. They were the accumulated intellectual heritage of a civilization that had flourished for more than 2,000 years. The Spanish missionaries, viewing these codices as instruments of pagan worship, systematically gathered and burned them. Bishop Diego de Landa of Yucatan supervised mass burnings in 1562, later writing that the Maya contained nothing in which there was not to be seen superstition and lies of the devil, and that we burned them all, which they regretted to an amazing degree, and which caused them much affliction. The destruction was nearly total. Of the thousands of codices that once existed, only 4 are known to survive today: the Dresden Codex, a masterpiece of astronomical calculation; the Madrid Codex, containing ritual almanacs; the Paris Codex, fragmentary and damaged; and the Grolier Codex, whose authenticity was confirmed only in 2016. 4 books out of an entire civilization's literary output spanning centuries. The parallel with the Amarna erasure is striking. In both cases, the destruction was motivated by religious conviction, by the belief that the knowledge being destroyed was not merely wrong but actively dangerous, contaminated by false belief offensive to the true deity or deities, and harmful to the spiritual welfare of the people who might encounter it. In both cases, the destroyers acted with a clear conscience, convinced that they were performing a service to the divine order by purging the world of heretical or pagan material. And in both cases, the destruction was so thorough that it has permanently impoverished our understanding of civilizations that were among the most intellectually sophisticated of their times. The loss of classical literature provides yet another perspective on the scale of cultural destruction that humanity has inflicted on its own intellectual heritage. Of the works of ancient Greek literature known to have existed from ancient references, catalogues, and quotations, only a small fraction survives. The works of the great tragedians illustrate the scale of the loss. Aeschylus wrote approximately 70 to 90 plays. 7 survive. Sophocles wrote more than 120. 7 survive. Euripides wrote approximately 92. 18 survive. And one of those was preserved by chance in a single manuscript. The comic playwright Menander, considered one of the greatest writers in the ancient world, was known for centuries only through fragments and quotations, until substantial portions of several of his plays were discovered on papyri in Egypt in the 20th century. The situation is even worse for prose literature. The philosophical writings of the pre-Socratic thinkers, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Democritus, Anaxagoras, survive only as fragments quoted by later authors. The historical works of Hecataeus of Miletus, one of the earliest Greek historians, are almost entirely lost. The writings of Callimachus, the chief librarian of the Library of Alexandria, and one of the most prolific authors of the ancient world, survive only in fragments and summaries. The complete works of the Stoic philosophers Zeno of Citium, Cleanthes, and Chrysippus, who collectively wrote hundreds of books, are lost except for fragments preserved in the writings of later critics and commentators. The Latin literature that survives is somewhat better preserved than the Greek, thanks largely to the efforts of medieval monastic scribes, but even so, the losses are enormous. The poetry of Ennius, considered the father of Latin literature, survives only in fragments. Most of the historical works of Livy, originally consisting of 142 books covering the history of Rome from its foundation to 9 of the Common Era, are lost. Only 35 books survive complete. These numbers, when considered carefully, reveal the staggering scale of cultural loss that humanity has suffered. We possess perhaps 1 to 2% of the literature produced by the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that fraction is not a random sample. It is biased toward works that happen to be valued by the particular monastic and scholarly traditions that maintain the chain of copying across the medieval period. Works that did not appeal to Christian sensibilities, works that were too technical or too obscure, works that existed in too few copies, works that were stored in libraries that burned or crumbled. All of these are gone. The literature we have, the works of Homer and Plato and Aristotle and Virgil and Cicero, magnificent as they are, represent the survivors of a selection process that was driven as much by accident, prejudice, and material vulnerability as by any objective measure of quality or importance. The numbers are striking. If we estimate conservatively that the ancient Mediterranean world produced perhaps 500,000 distinct literary works over the course of 1,000 years, and if we possess perhaps 5,000 of those works in substantially complete form, the survival rate is approximately 1%. 99% of the intellectual output of the ancient Mediterranean is gone. Not hidden, not waiting in some undiscovered library. Gone. Decayed, burned, recycled, lost in floods and wars and collapses of institutions, and never copied, never transmitted, never preserved across the centuries of disruption that separated the ancient world from the medieval one. Meritaten's story exists within this vast context of loss. She is one name among millions that have been forgotten. She is one life among countless lives that have been erased by the combination of deliberate destruction and natural decay that has stripped the ancient world of most of its human detail. But her case is distinctive because the erasure that consumed her memory was not passive. It was not the result of neglect or accident or the slow grinding of time. It was active. It was intentional. It was carried out by human hands, guided by human decisions, motivated by human politics and human theology. The people who erased Meritaten knew exactly what they were doing. They understood the power of memory. They understood the power of erasure, and they chose erasure deliberately, systematically, and with the full backing of the state apparatus. This deliberate quality is what distinguishes the Amarna erasure from the ordinary processes of knowledge loss that have affected every civilization in history. When a library burns by accident, when a papyrus crumbles from neglect, when a language dies because its last speakers pass away without children to carry it forward, these are tragedies. But they are impersonal tragedies, the result of forces that are, in some sense, beyond human control. The erasure of Meritaten was not impersonal. It was a choice, a decision, a policy implemented over decades by people who had the power to determine what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. That power, the power to control memory, the power to decide whose story gets told and whose gets silenced, is one of the most dangerous powers any human being or institution can possess. And it has been exercised, with devastating effect, in every civilization and every century of recorded history. The case of Sappho, the great poet of Lesbos, provides an intimate example of how this power operates. Sappho was considered by the ancient Greeks to be one of the supreme poets of their civilization. Plato called her the 10th muse. Her work was admired, quoted, studied, and emulated for centuries. She wrote 9 books of lyric poetry. What survives? Fragments, scraps, lines quoted by other authors, a single complete poem discovered on a potsherd. The rest is gone. Some was lost to the ordinary processes of decay and neglect. But Sappho's work was also targeted for destruction by early Christian authorities who objected to its content, particularly the poems that expressed love and desire between women. How much of Sappho's work was actively destroyed, as opposed to simply lost through inattention, is debated, but the result is the same. One of the greatest poets of the ancient world is known to us through fragments so small that they sometimes consist of a single word or phrase, tantalizing hints of the beauty that once existed, enough to make us mourn the loss without being enough to fill it. Now imagine the same process applied not to a single poet but to an entire civilization. That is what happened to the Amarna period. The literary, artistic, theological, and administrative output of 17 to 20 years of Egyptian civilization, a period of unprecedented creativity and radical experimentation, was subjected to a systematic campaign of destruction that reduced it to fragments. What survives of Meritaten's world is the equivalent of a Sappho fragment, enough to know that something remarkable existed, enough to construct partial and contested narratives, but not enough to recover the full richness of what was lost. The technologies specific to the Amarna period illustrate another dimension of this loss: the artistic innovations of the Amarna court, the naturalistic style, the intimate family scenes, the radical departure from traditional conventions were not merely aesthetic choices. They required specific technical skills, new methods of carving relief, new approaches to painting, new ways of rendering the human body and human emotion in stone and pigment. The artists of the Amarna period had to develop these techniques in a strikingly short time because the revolution that demanded them was itself compressed into less than 2 decades. Some of the most accomplished works of Amarna art, including the bust of Nefertiti, display a mastery of materials and technique that suggests a community of artists working at the very highest level of their craft. When the Amarna period ended, this artistic tradition was suppressed. The post-Amarna restoration did not merely stop producing Amarna-style art. It actively rejected it, returning to the conventional styles that had characterized Egyptian art before the revolution. The artists who had developed the Amarna style, who had spent years or decades refining their techniques, were either forced to unlearn everything they had mastered and return to the old conventions, or they were removed from their positions entirely. Either way, the specific technical knowledge embedded in Amarna art, the way the sculptors of the period achieved their distinctive effects, the pigments they used, the tools they employed, the methods they developed for rendering the play of light on human skin, the techniques they used to create the illusion of depth and volume in shallow relief, all of this was lost. Modern art historians have studied Amarna art intensively, using every analytical technique available, from X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy to computed tomography scanning. They have identified some of the materials and methods used. They have analyzed the tool marks on the sculptures. They have studied the pigments. But the full range of knowledge that the Amarna artists possessed, the tacit understanding of materials and methods that comes only from years of practice, the aesthetic sensibility that guided their creative decisions, the workshop traditions that connected master to apprentice, all of this is beyond recovery. We can describe what they produced. We cannot explain, with full confidence, how they produced it, any more than we can explain, with full confidence, how the builders of the Great Pyramid placed their blocks with such precision. The products survive. The processes do not. The glass-working technology of the Amarna period provides a specific and poignant example. Tel El, Amarna was home to glass workshops that produced some of the finest glass objects of the ancient world. Excavations have revealed evidence of glass production facilities, including fragments of crucibles, remnants of raw glass, and the remains of kilns. The glass produced at Amarna was of exceptional quality, vivid in color, fine in texture, and worked into intricate vessels, jewelry, and inlay pieces that demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of glass chemistry and forming techniques. The colors achieved by Amarna glassmakers, particularly the deep cobalt blues and opaque yellows, required precise control of mineral additives, including cobalt from the western desert oases and antimonate of lead for the yellows. The recipes for these colorants, the temperature profiles of the kilns, the techniques for forming and decorating the vessels, all of this was specialized knowledge held by the craftsmen of the Amarna workshops. When the city was abandoned, the workshops were abandoned with them. The craftsmen dispersed. Their particular combination of skills and knowledge, refined over years of practice in those specific workshops with those specific materials, was disrupted and gradually lost. Glass production did not disappear from Egypt entirely. It continued in other locations and other periods. But the specific achievements of the Amarna glass workshops, the particular quality and character of their output, were not replicated. The tradition was broken, and what came after was different, not necessarily inferior in every respect, but different, drawing on different sources of expertise and different institutional support. The Amarna glass tradition is another of those vanished peaks on the landscape of human achievement, a level of mastery attained briefly by a specific community in specific circumstances, and then lost when those circumstances changed. The accumulation of these examples, from Roman concrete to Greek fire to Damascus steel, to the Antikythera mechanism, to the Maya codices, to the works of Sappho, to the glass workshops of Amarna, begins to create a picture that is profoundly unsettling. We are accustomed to thinking of human history as a narrative of progress, of knowledge steadily accumulating like snow on a mountainside, each generation adding to the deposit left by the one before. But the evidence tells a different story. Human history is not a steady accumulation. It is a cycle of accumulation and loss, of building and destruction, of discovery and forgetting. The mountainside is swept by avalanches that remove centuries of accumulated deposit in a single catastrophic event. The snowpack is melted by the warm winds of war and conquest and political upheaval. And when the next generation arrives, they must begin again, building on whatever fragments the previous generation managed to leave behind, without knowing how much was lost, without knowing what questions to ask about what they do not know. They do not know. There is a deeper truth buried beneath the accumulated weight of these examples, a truth that goes beyond the specific losses we have cataloged and points to something fundamental about the nature of human civilization itself. It is a truth that, once seen, cannot be unseen, and it changes the way we think about everything from museums to memory to the meaning of history itself. The truth is this: we do not inherit the past. We inherit the wreckage of the past. What reaches us across the centuries is not a curated collection of humanity's greatest achievements, carefully selected and lovingly preserved for the benefit of future generations. It is a debris field, the scattered remnants of civilizations that produced far more than has survived, filtered through the arbitrary processes of decay, destruction, and deliberate erasure that strip the past of most of its substance before it reaches us. We walk through museums and imagine we are seeing the ancient world. We are not. We are seeing what the ancient world dropped on its way to oblivion, the things that fell between the cracks, the things that were buried too deep to be recycled, the things that were carved in stone hard enough to resist the chisel of the censer and the tooth of time. Let that sink in. Every artifact in every museum in the world is a survivor, a thing that beat the odds, a lottery winner in the greatest and cruelest lottery ever devised. The head of Nefertiti in Berlin survived because it was buried in the ruins of a sculptor's workshop in a city that was abandoned and forgotten for 3,000 years. The Rosetta Stone survived because it was built into a wall by Mamluk soldiers who had no idea what it was. The Dead Sea Scrolls survived because they were sealed in jars and hidden in caves in one of the driest places on earth. The Amarna letters survived because they were inscribed on clay rather than papyrus, in a language other than Egyptian, and were abandoned in the ruins of a city that no one cared enough to demolish systematically. Each survival is a fluke. Each artifact we possess is surrounded by the ghosts of thousands that did not make it. Meritaten is one of those ghosts. Not a complete ghost, not a total absence, but something almost worse. A partial presence, a silhouette, a shape defined by the things around it rather than by its own substance. We know she existed because her name appears on objects and in inscriptions that escaped the chisel. We know she held important titles because those titles appear alongside her name in the fragments that survive. We know she lived during one of the most turbulent periods in Egyptian history because the period itself, despite the best efforts of its erasers, left too many traces to be completely denied. But the woman herself, the living, breathing, thinking, feeling person who bore the name Meritaten and held the title Great Royal Wife and may have governed Egypt during its darkest hour. That person is gone. Not dead in the ordinary sense where the body perishes but the memory endures. Gone in the deeper sense where the memory itself has been destroyed and the person is reduced to a name, a title, and a question mark. The philosophical implications of this are profound and unsettling. We tend to think of the past as fixed. It happened. It is over. It cannot be changed. But this is only true of the events themselves. The record of those events, the evidence through which we access the past, is not fixed at all. It is constantly being modified, not by time travelers or revisionist historians, but by the ordinary processes of decay, destruction, and human decision. making that determine what survives and what does not. The past that we study is not the past that existed. It is the past that was permitted to survive. And the gap between those two things, between what existed and what survived, is the abyss into which Meritaten and millions of others have fallen. This is not science fiction. This is the ordinary condition of human knowledge across the entire span of recorded history. Every civilization that has ever existed has lost the majority of its intellectual and cultural output. Every generation that has ever lived has known things that subsequent generations have forgotten. The accumulation of knowledge is real, but so is the loss of knowledge, and the two processes operate simultaneously, in constant tension, like two tides pulling in opposite directions. Sometimes the tide of accumulation is stronger, and knowledge grows. Sometimes the tide of loss is stronger, and knowledge shrinks. And at certain catastrophic moments, war, revolution, plague, the collapse of a major civilization, the tide of loss becomes overwhelming, and centuries of accumulated knowledge are swept away in a single generation. The Amarna period was one of those catastrophic moments, not because of an external invasion or a natural disaster, but because of something far more insidious, a deliberate, state-sponsored campaign to control the content of collective memory. The pharaohs who succeeded the Amarna rulers did not merely defeat their predecessors. They attempted to unmake them, to reach back into the past and remove them from history, to create a version of the past in which the Amarna period had never occurred. And they nearly succeeded for 3,000 years. The Amarna period was a blank space in the official record, a gap in the king lists, a silence in the conversation of Egyptian history. The implications of this near success should disturb us deeply. If a civilization as literate, as bureaucratic, as obsessively record, keeping as ancient Egypt could erase 20 years of its own history so thoroughly that the erasure was not even detected until the 19th century, what else has been erased? What other gaps in the historical record of other civilizations are not gaps at all, but the scars of deliberate erasure? How many other Meritatens, how many other rulers whose reigns were inconvenient to their successors, how many other revolutionary movements that threatened the established order? How many other intellectual traditions that challenged the prevailing orthodoxy have been erased so completely that we do not even know to look for them? The question is not merely theoretical. We know of cases in which deliberate erasure has been attempted in more recent history. The Soviet Union routinely erased disgraced officials from photographs, replacing them with anonymous backgrounds, or inserting other figures in their place. China's Cultural Revolution destroyed vast quantities of historical artifacts, texts, and artwork in an attempt to erase the past and create a new society unburdened by tradition. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia targeted the educated class for extermination, killing teachers, doctors, engineers, and anyone who wore glasses in a genocidal campaign that was explicitly designed to destroy the knowledge infrastructure of the country. In each of these cases, the erasure was partial and ultimately unsuccessful, because the modern world, with its distributed networks of information, its international media, and its redundant archives, is far more resistant to centralized memory control than the ancient world was. But the ancient world had no such redundancy. A papyrus document existed in one copy, or at most a handful. An inscription on a temple wall existed in one location. An oral tradition existed only in the minds of the people who knew it. When these were destroyed, the destruction was final. There was no backup server, no distributed network, no international archive holding copies of the material that was being erased. The erasers had only to be thorough enough, persistent enough, and powerful enough, and they could remove a person, a movement, an entire period of history from the collective memory of a civilization. They did not need to destroy every trace. They only needed to destroy enough traces that the remaining fragments would be insufficient to reconstruct a coherent narrative. This is exactly what happened to Meritaten. The fragments that survive are enough to tell us that she existed, that she held important positions, and that she lived during a period of crisis. They are not enough to tell us who she was. The gap between these two levels of knowledge, between knowing that someone existed and knowing who they were, is the space in which the erasers succeeded. They did not quite erase Meritaten from history, but they erased her from history in the way that matters most. They erased her personality, her decisions, her relationships, her inner life, her contribution to the events of her time. They left her name stripped of everything that made it meaningful. They left the skeleton and removed the soul. Let that sink in. Consider what it would mean if the same thing were done to a modern figure of comparable importance. Imagine if every photograph, every document, every email, every recording, every personal letter, every government file, every newspaper article, every memoir, every biography associated with a major head of state were systematically destroyed, and all that remained were a few fragmentary references in the archives of foreign governments and a handful of objects that bore the leader's name. We would know the name, we would know the approximate dates, we would know some of the titles, we would know almost nothing else. That is the position we are in with Meritaten, and the people who put us in that position did so deliberately, knowing exactly what they were taking away. The deeper truth, then, is not merely that knowledge is fragile. It is that knowledge is political. The decision to preserve or destroy, to remember or forget, to amplify or silence is never neutral. It is always an exercise of power. The people who controlled the temples and archives of ancient Egypt after the Amarna period had the power to decide what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. They used that power to erase a revolution, to silence a dynasty, and to remove a woman from the record of human achievement. They used it because they could. They used it because they believed it was right. And they used it because they understood, with a clarity that should make us uncomfortable, that memory is not a mirror. Memory is a tool, and tools can be wielded for many purposes, not all of them benign. The ruins of Tel El Amarna lie in the desert of Middle Egypt, a desolate stretch of ground between the river and the cliffs, where the outlines of Akhenaten's dream city are still visible as patterns of low walls and foundations in the sand. Walking through these ruins, an observer can trace the plan of the great Aten temple, the largest religious structure ever built in Egypt. Its open courts once filled with hundreds of offering tables for the worship of the sun disk. The temple was demolished after the abandonment of the city, its blocks carried away for reuse in other constructions. What remains is a ghost, a negative space, a shape defined by what was taken away rather than by what was left. The same is true of Meritaten herself. She is a negative space in the historical record, a shape defined by the chisel marks where her name was removed, the blank walls where her image was scraped away, the empty lines in the king lists where her reign, if she reigned, should appear. The ruins of Amarna and the ruins of Meritaten's memory are one and the same thing. Both are monuments to destruction. Both are evidence of the human capacity to build and the human capacity to unbuild. Both ask the same question, the question that runs through this entire story like a thread through a labyrinth. What else has been destroyed? What other memories have been unmade? What other truths have been scraped from the walls and swept from the record and consigned to the silence of the desert? The answer to those questions is far more than we know, far more than we can estimate, far more than the most pessimistic assessment of cultural loss can account for. Because the things we know we have lost, the specific texts and technologies and traditions that are documented as having existed and then vanished, are only the visible portion of the loss. Beneath them lies a much larger category of loss, the things we do not know we have lost, the ideas, the innovations, the discoveries, the artistic achievements, the philosophical insights that were never documented in any surviving source, that left no trace in any archive or inscription, that existed only in the minds and hands and voices of the people who created them, and that vanished when those people died or were silenced. Consider the women of ancient Egypt specifically, because Meritaten's story is inseparable from the broader question of how women's lives have been recorded, preserved, and erased throughout history. Egyptian women enjoyed more legal rights and social freedoms than women in most other ancient civilizations. They could own property, conduct business, initiate divorce, and serve as priests in certain cults. Some, like Hatshepsut and possibly Meritaten herself, rose to the highest level of political power. Yet the written record of ancient Egypt was overwhelmingly produced by men, stored in male-dominated institutions, and preserved through chains of transmission controlled by male scribes and priests. The experiences, perspectives, and contributions of women were systematically underrepresented in the written record, not because women did not contribute to Egyptian civilization, but because the people who controlled the record did not consider women's contributions important enough to document in detail. The result is that we know far less about the women of ancient Egypt than about the men, even though women constituted half the population and were involved in every aspect of economic, social, religious, and in some cases political life. The women who do appear in the record tend to be royal women, queens and princesses, whose importance was derived from their relationship to the pharaoh. Even these women are often depicted in subsidiary roles, standing behind the pharaoh, supporting his rituals, producing his heirs. The independent agency of royal women, their political decisions, their diplomatic activities, their intellectual contributions, is rarely documented directly. We infer it from indirect evidence: a title that suggests administrative responsibility, a letter that suggests diplomatic initiative, an image that suggests ritual authority. But inference is not the same as evidence, and the gaps in our knowledge are enormous. Meritaten's story is shaped by this broader pattern. She appears in the record primarily as a member of the royal family, as a daughter of Akhenaten, and Nefertiti as a great royal wife, as a participant in religious ceremonies. Her individual actions, her personal decisions, her role in the political crises that engulfed her family are almost entirely undocumented. Did she support her father's religious revolution? Did she have doubts? Did she play a role in the diplomatic overtures to the Hittite king? Did she resist the restoration of the old religion? Or did she accommodate it? Did she exercise real political power? Or was she a figurehead manipulated by powerful courtiers? We do not know. We cannot know. The evidence that could have answered these questions was destroyed by people who saw no reason to preserve the memory of a woman they considered complicit in a heretical project. The gendered dimension of this erasure adds another layer of tragedy to an already tragic story. When the Amarna period was erased from the official record, the women of the period were erased more thoroughly than the men. Akhenaten, the male pharaoh who initiated the revolution, was eventually rediscovered and has become one of the most studied and debated figures in Egyptology. His monuments were destroyed, but his distinctive artistic style, his radical theology, his bold political moves have made him a subject of endless scholarly fascination. Nefertiti, his queen, was rediscovered through the famous bust found in Thutmose's workshop and has become an icon recognized worldwide. But Meritaten, the eldest daughter, the woman who may have held the kingdom together during its collapse, remains in the shadows. She is known to specialists. She is debated in academic journals. She is the subject of scholarly articles with titles that begin with phrases like "the problem of" or "the question of." She is not known to the general public. She is not recognized. She is not remembered in the way that her father and mother, for all their own losses, have come to be remembered. The irony is almost unbearable. The Amarna period was, among other things, the most family-centered era in Egyptian art, and possibly in Egyptian political ideology. The royal family was depicted together more frequently, more intimately, and more prominently than in any other period of Egyptian history. Meritaten appeared in these family scenes from infancy. She was, in the visual language of the Amarna period, an essential element of the image that Akhenaten presented to the world. She was not peripheral, she was central. And yet the memory that survived the erasure has gradually reconfigured the Amarna story into a narrative that centers on Akhenaten's theology and Nefertiti's beauty. While Meritaten, the child who grew up in that extraordinary family and who may have been called upon to salvage what remained when it fell apart, is relegated to the margins of a story in which she was originally at the center, this marginalization is not the work of the ancient erasers alone. It is also the work of modern scholarship, modern media, and modern public interest, all of which have favored the dramatic figures, the heretic king and the beautiful queen, over the more ambiguous and less visually dramatic figure of the eldest daughter. The modern erasure of Meritaten is softer and less deliberate than the ancient one, but in its own way, it is just as effective. She is not suppressed. She is simply overlooked. She is not silenced. She is simply not heard, because the noise of more famous names drowns her out. And so, the question that Meritaten's story ultimately poses is not merely about the ancient past. It is about the present. It is about how we choose what to remember and what to forget, what to study and what to ignore, whose stories to tell and whose to leave in silence. It is about the politics of memory, the economics of attention, and the moral responsibility that comes with the power to shape the narratives through which future generations will understand the past. The ancient Egyptians who erased Meritaten did so with chisels and hammers. We do it with neglect. The tools are different. The result is the same. What does it mean for us, the living, the inheritors of this fractured record, to know that the past is not merely incomplete, but actively distorted? What are the implications of understanding that history is not a window through which we observe the past, but a wall with a few cracks in it, through which we catch distorted glimpses of events that were far richer, far more complex, and far more ambiguous than anything we can reconstruct? The first implication is epistemological. It concerns the limits of what we can know. If the surviving evidence from the ancient world is biased, fragmentary, and in some cases deliberately falsified, then every conclusion we draw from that evidence must carry an asterisk. A caveat, a quiet acknowledgement that we are working with a sample that is neither random nor representative. This does not mean that we cannot study the past. It does not mean that historical scholarship is futile. It means that historical scholarship must be practiced with humility, with an awareness of its limitations, with a constant vigilance against the temptation to fill gaps in the evidence with assumptions, and to mistake the absence of evidence for evidence of absence. The story of Meritaten is a case study in this epistemological humility. Every statement we make about her life is provisional. Every reconstruction of her role in the events of the late Amarna period is tentative. Every theory about her fate is speculative. And this is not because scholars have failed to do their work properly. It is because the evidence has been destroyed deliberately and systematically by people who had the power and the motivation to ensure that Meritaten's story would not be told. The scholars who study her are not limited by their own inadequacy. They are limited by the inadequacy of the evidence, an inadequacy that was imposed by human action, not by natural processes. The second implication is moral. It concerns our responsibility to the people whose stories have been erased. When we discover that a life has been deliberately silenced, that a person's contributions have been intentionally removed from the record, we have a choice. We can accept the erasure, treating it as a fait accompli, an irreversible act that cannot be undone, or we can resist it, not by pretending to know things we do not know, not by inventing details to fill the gaps, but by insisting on the existence of the gaps themselves, by pointing to the chisel marks on the walls and saying someone was here. Someone's name was written here. Someone's story was told here. And someone else decided that it should not be. The refusal to accept erasure, the insistence on acknowledging what was lost, even when it cannot be recovered, is itself a moral act, a form of witness, a way of honoring the dead by refusing to pretend they never lived. This is what scholars of the Amarna period do, often without articulating it in these terms. Every time an Egyptologist writes a paper about Meritaten, every time a historian includes her name in a discussion of the 18th dynasty succession, every time a museum labels a fragment with her name and displays it for the public to see, they are performing an act of resistance against the erasure that was imposed 3,000 years ago. They are saying the erasers did not succeed completely. The name survives. The question survives. The awareness that something was here, something important, something that was deliberately destroyed, survives. It is not enough. It will never be enough to replace what was lost. But it is not nothing. The third implication is practical and urgent. If the past teaches us anything, it teaches us that knowledge is not self-preserving. It does not maintain itself. It does not accumulate automatically from generation to generation. It requires active, continuous, costly effort to preserve. Libraries must be funded, archives must be maintained, scholars must be trained, languages must be studied, traditions must be documented, and above all, the recognition that knowledge is fragile, that it can be lost, that it has been lost on a massive scale throughout human history, must be kept alive in the public consciousness, so that the institutions and practices that protect knowledge receive the support they need to continue their work. The digital age has created an illusion of permanence that is perhaps the greatest threat to knowledge preservation in our time. We produce more information than any civilization in history. We store it on media that degrade faster than papyrus. We encode it in formats that become obsolete within years. We maintain it in institutions that depend on continuous funding, staffing, and organizational continuity. And we assume, with a complacency that would have baffled the ancient Egyptians, who understood the fragility of memory better than we do, that all of this information will simply persist, that it will be there when we need it, that the servers will keep running, the formats will remain readable, and the institutions will remain functional. This assumption is not supported by the evidence. It is contradicted by the evidence. The evidence drawn from every civilization and every century of recorded history tells us that knowledge is lost, constantly, inevitably, and on a scale that defies casual comprehension. There is a moment, standing in the ruins of Tel El Amarna, when the full weight of these reflections settles on the mind like desert dust. The sun beats down on the empty foundation trenches where Akhenaten's temples once stood. The wind carries sand across the ghost of a city that housed perhaps 30,000 people at its peak, and that was abandoned within a few years of its founder's death. The cliffs that define the eastern boundary of the site are carved with the tombs of Amarna's officials, their walls decorated with scenes of daily life in the city that no longer exists. And somewhere in this landscape, in a tomb that may or may not have been completed, in a burial that may or may not have been disturbed, Meritaten may have been laid to rest with the prayers and rituals appropriate to a great royal wife, or she may have died far from here, in a different city, in different circumstances, unmourned or mourned by people whose grief was never recorded. We do not know. The sand keeps its secrets. The stones do not speak, but the silence itself speaks if we are willing to listen. It speaks of power and its abuses. It speaks of the human capacity to create and the human capacity to destroy. It speaks of women whose contributions were erased and whose names were scraped from the walls of memory by men who found those contributions threatening or inconvenient. It speaks of a civilization that believed so deeply in the power of the written word that it developed a punishment more terrible than death, the destruction of the name, the killing of memory, the annihilation of the self across all dimensions of time. And it speaks, most quietly and most insistently, of all the other silences in the historical record, all the other gaps and absences and chisel marks that we have learned to overlook because they are so numerous and so pervasive that we have come to mistake them for the natural texture of the past rather than the scars of deliberate violence. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, in a room that most visitors pass through on their way to the golden mask of Tutankhamun, there are fragments. Pieces of limestone relief from Amarna temples, shattered faces, broken hands reaching toward a sun that no longer shines, the remnants of a world that was built in haste, inhabited in fervor, and destroyed in anger. Among these fragments, if you know where to look, you can find traces of Meritaten, a curve of cheek, a line of jaw, the ghost of a name, half chiseled away, still legible if you lean close enough and know the hieroglyphs well enough to read what the chisel tried to erase. She is there, barely, but she is there. Meritaten was the eldest daughter of a heretic and a queen. She was born into a revolution and raised in a city built from nothing in the desert. She watched her father reshape the religious landscape of the most powerful civilization on earth. She watched her sisters die. She watched her mother disappear from the record, whether into death or into a new identity that we cannot identify with certainty. She was elevated to the highest title a woman could hold. She may have governed a kingdom. She may have written to a foreign king, offering him the throne of Egypt in exchange for a prince to share it with. She may have been betrayed by the very people she sought to save. And then she, too, disappeared, swallowed by the same silence that consumed the rest of her family, erased by the same chisels that scraped her father's name from the walls of Karnak. Her story is a story of power and powerlessness, of visibility and invisibility, of creation and destruction. It is a story of what happens when a society decides that certain truths are too dangerous to remember. It is a story about the fragility of memory and the vulnerability of the individual in the face of institutional power. And it is a story that repeats itself in different forms and different contexts throughout the entire history of human civilization. Every burned library is a Meritaten. Every silenced voice is a Meritaten. Every language that dies without a record is a Meritaten. Every tradition that is abandoned, every craft that is forgotten, every discovery that is made and then lost, every insight that flickers briefly in a single mind and then goes out when that mind goes dark. All of these are Meritatens, lives and achievements and truths that once existed, and that exist no longer, erased by the combination of human action and the ordinary passage of time. We live in the wreckage of the past. We study the fragments. We piece together stories from the broken edges of things that were once whole, and we do this knowing, if we are honest with ourselves, that the stories we construct are only approximations, shadows cast on the wall of a cave by the firelight of our limited evidence. The real story, the full story, the story of Meritaten, as she knew it and lived it and felt it, is gone. It was taken from us by people who believed they had the right to determine what would be remembered. And the empty space where that story should be, the silence where her voice should be, the gap in the record where her reign and her choices and her fate should be recorded, is not merely an academic problem. It is a wound in the body of human knowledge, a wound that will never heal because the flesh that was cut away has been consumed by time and cannot grow back. 3,300 years ago, give or take a generation, a woman named Meritaten walked the corridors of a palace in the desert, a palace dedicated to a god of light, in a city built to celebrate the dawn of a new era. She held the title beloved of the Aten. She was the daughter of a pharaoh and a queen, whose beauty would be remembered in fragmentary fashion. For millennia, she was given responsibilities that few women in the ancient world were permitted to hold. She may have wielded power that shaped the course of nations, and she left behind when she departed the world traces so faint that they are almost indistinguishable from the natural marks of weathering on limestone. The faintness of those traces is not a measure of her insignificance. It is a measure of the power of erasure. It is a measure of the violence that can be done to a human life by the systematic destruction of its memory. And it is a reminder, the quietest and most persistent of reminders, that the past is not a given. It is not a stable foundation on which we stand. It is a construction built and rebuilt and demolished and rebuilt again by the generations that inherit it, each one adding some things and removing others, each one shaping the record to fit its own needs and prejudices and fears. Meritaten deserves to be remembered, not because we can reconstruct her life in sufficient detail to write her biography, we cannot. Not because we can celebrate her achievements, which are largely unknown to us. Not because we can honor her beliefs, which were suppressed and forgotten and are now accessible only through fragmentary and contested evidence. She deserves to be remembered because she existed. Because she was a human being who lived and loved and struggled and lost. Because she was erased not by the indifferent forces of nature, but by the deliberate choice of other human beings. And because the act of remembering her, even in this fragmentary and uncertain way, is an act of defiance against the erasure, a refusal to accept the verdict of the chisels, a small but meaningful assertion that the truth matters, that every life matters, that the attempt to destroy a memory does not make the thing remembered any less real. The sun sets over the ruins of Tel El Amarna. The shadows lengthen across the empty foundation trenches. The cliffs glow amber in the last light, and somewhere in the sand, buried or scattered or reduced to dust too fine for any instrument to detect, are the remains of everything that Meritaten was and everything that her world contained. The revolution, the art, the prayers, the diplomacy, the crisis, the fall, all of it reduced to silence, to sand, to the slow, patient, relentless work of time on the works of human hands. But her name survives, damaged, incomplete, nearly destroyed, but present, still legible on a handful of stones that the chisels missed or the sand protected. Still whispered by the scholars who have devoted their careers to reassembling the shattered mirror of the Amarna past. Still spoken across the millennia, in languages she never knew existed, in countries she never imagined, by people who will never walk the streets of the city where she once lived, Meritaten, beloved of the Aten, eldest daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, great royal wife, perhaps pharaoh, perhaps author of the most extraordinary diplomatic gambit in the history of the ancient world, perhaps nothing more than a name on a broken stone. The truth lies somewhere in the silence, and the silence, as always, keeps its own counsel.